Hey, Tanisha. How you doing, Tanisha? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes,
Okay, good. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Doing all right. Looking forward to the long weekend.
Same here.
There we go. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing well.
Okay.
እንደ እሱ በማድረግ በአራንቺ ነገር ነው።
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It is 12, and I realize a lot of you are probably on your lunch, so I want to be respectful of your time. Our guest today is Stan Weiserman from MicroFocus. He's actually hung out with us a couple of times for some of these lunch and learns, so I appreciate that he's here and willing to share some more information with us. So today our topic is DevSecOps, and he will be talking about keeping pace with the trends in cybersecurity. So I will turn it over to him.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, great. So thanks, Tanisha. And again, I want to make this interactive session. The topic that I'm raising up to you guys today is DevSecOps, and I'll get into what that means if you don't know in a minute. First off, are you seeing the presentation itself, or are you seeing the presenter mode, Tanisha?
I see the presentation now.
Okay, great. And I just wanted to make sure I was showing the right thing. Sometimes the displays, too many displays. So before I get in specifically around DevSecOps, I just want to hit some of the trends out there that we're seeing. And there is the whole concept of development, security operations, and I'll get into that. But there are other things out there too, like container security. Containers are being used more frequently. So how do you secure those containers? Infrastructure as code is very popular as far as how you're actually doing deployments in cloud environments, and how do you secure those templates. vulnerability management, application layer, kind of vulnerabilities and findings and weaknesses that you find is certainly big. Trying to, you have all these different testing techniques. So it's static application security testing, which is SAST, and dynamic application security testing, which is dynamic, which is like simulating a pen test, as Tanisha can tell you. Merging those results to actually get more fidelity as to what you need to prioritize. There's a lot of cloud native development, and likewise, how do you support those environments for your testing? The attack surface that the application programming interfaces provide is a growing concern as hackers are leveraging those APIs to hack into applications. And then there's a whole open source security, and more broadly, the supply chain of software components, whether it be open source or custom. All those are issues right now. And I am going to focus today on DevSecOps, but if we want to talk about any of these other issues, can certainly do that as well. So, first off, let's just talk about DevOps for a second. Make sure we all are aligned with what that means. And it really is that a merging collision, right, of two major related trends. The first was the so-called agile infrastructure or agile operations, sprang up from applying agile and lean approaches to operations work. And the second is a much expanded understanding of the value of collaboration between the development and the operations staff throughout all stages of the development lifecycle when creating and operating a service, and how important it is for operations to become part of that service-oriented world. Now, the result of DevOps and the success is that they're able to do code deployments much more frequently. In some situations, when it's content-based, you could have hundreds of pushes of content a day or thousands a week, but the frequency of releases is also much faster. And then, as far as potential for recovery, again, you could have sprints to be able to deal with issues faster as well. I grew up in the days of more of a waterfall spiral kind of application development kind of process or system development lifecycle, and dealt with timeframes of a year, 18 months, 2 years of getting releases out, which is unheard of now. It just wouldn't cope in today's world. And so, as far as why DevSecOps, well, most organizations are in the midst of this transformation, right? They're either have their toe in to DevOps or they're all in, and organizations are seeing the benefits, and they can't in many cases wait for security to keep pace. Unfortunately, but the threat landscape and the vulnerability of applications that are in prod and the exploit of them, they can't ignore security either. So you need to inject security into DevOps. Some would argue that security by default should be part of DevOps, and you don't have to have DevSecOps. You just say DevOps, and security is part of it, right? And that's fair. But we emphasize it because many times security is left on the side, and that's something we're trying to change, right? The goal of DevSecOps is to make sure that security is part of that software development workflow, and that secure coding best practices and other activities, test automation for security, is all built into CI/CD pipelines, rather than being handled elsewhere later down the stream by somebody else. And a lot of times you're hearing this referred to as shifting security left or shift left. Last year we sponsored a big survey of a lot of different organizations, executives, about their DevSecOps activities and plans and challenges. And I'll share some of that results with you as far as the survey results and some of the upcoming slides. But before I get there, I just want to, put a model up of, if you look at this infinity sign, what you see representing DevOps many times as far as that continuous development, deployment, and integration. You can integrate in a number of different security type of activities. The challenge, honestly, with doing this is how to effectively include security without adding friction to the development process and workflow. And so how can you, turn the results of your static analysis that you see up on the top left quickly to the developers and the tools that they're used to, and enable them to continue with their cadence without having to slow down too much? Can you really do a threat model in a way which is agile enough and fast enough and consumable to the development organization? Are you able to do the kind of monitoring of potential weaknesses and provide that feedback to impact the coding at the next sprint? So that's the challenge, is the pace. The development teams don't have patience for processes that can slow them down, and so that's the hurdle that many times you have to jump over as a security side of the house. And again, if you look at what some of the drivers are, and this is some of the survey results we got back, more efficient software development is the primary driver, with security threats a second, as far as why you'd want to do is DevSecOps. The faster you release software into production, a way of you can look at it is the faster vulnerabilities can also be released, right? So as you're pushing this software out quickly into prod, those weaknesses are also potentially being exploited or being made visible. And without security being built in, DevOps can rapidly increase an organization's application attack surface and risks. So that's why DevSecOps is a motivation to actually take that time and effort to figure out how to integrate it in. And there is no cookie cutter way of doing this. You have to delve into understanding what, not only the organization, but many times the actual dev teams themselves, what tool sets they're using, the dev tool chains that they use, the processes that they use, and figure out how to integrate security in, because there's no one right answer for doing that. I'll pause there to see if there are any questions. All right. So some of the obstacles, as far as preventing or stalling DevSecOps initiatives, one is around the budget, and that's the main obstacle as far as getting the monies to actually integrate this in effectively. Some of the other obstacles they found were finding the right skilled individuals to be able to actually work with the development teams and have a security mindset. Optimally, you'd have a security representative in each development team project who becomes the team security lead in a development project. But cybersecurity teams usually don't have the budget to provide the pool of resources necessary, either in the numbers or the skill sets, to source the coverage needed for all those project teams. And I'll talk more about this a little later. That's why sometimes you see this creation of a security champion role that helps bridge the two. But one way of dealing with this is to have developers get a better understanding of why security is important, and hopefully create a culture that instills the understanding that security is not just a pain in the ass, it's actually important. And you know, and some dev teams are getting it. I mean, they certainly in some organizations are understanding the importance, but it takes some time to actually get that shift. You
So
know,
just a quick
yeah, go
comment.
ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, having been in the QA portion and, you know, currently in like more of the penetration testing, like I've actually experienced a lot of that, you know, I guess that infinity sign, you know, just within my day-to-day work. And what I would say is that, you know, I think part of the issue is that, you know, generally cybersecurity and computer science, you know, the development piece are taught as two different disciplines, right?
Mhm.
Whereas when you're doing when you're doing computer science education, you may take a cybersecurity course here or there, but
Right.
really, you know, it's not integrated together, right? And I think that in order for us to be able to successfully shift left, you know, it's not so much that we include like a security champion or that we include someone that can advocate for security so that we can kind of catch some of these issues prior to, you know, them actually making it to production. I think that we just need to get developers that are more trained in security, which means, you know, we need to update, I think, the education piece as well, so that we have more people who, you know, instead of cybersecurity and computer science being taught as two different disciplines, I really think that they should be, you know, integrated into one, whereas you can't take one without the other, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. I mean, I certainly have been encouraged by some of the curriculums out there, to your point, that at least includes a class or two in the, you know, many times, let's face it, it's network security, but they offer sometimes software security, application security. My old boss and I, you know, taught a class on software security at George Mason, a local college here in Virginia, and I taught a couple of those classes. So it's good to see that. But to your point, that usually just is a one-off add-on, right? It's not integrated into the actual homework or exercises or programs they're developing, as far as security being emphasized throughout the 4 years they're there. And I think it's nice to believe that we could make that change. I think there's been some work in some of those programs to do that, but it's a real hard nut to crack, Tanisha, really is. So, you know, one of the things that I found is trying to raise that awareness as early as possible in the development process, and then also integrating in the tools to make it as seamless as possible to help ensure that the results of tests as well as other feedback go to the developers as early on as possible. You know, if you haven't seen it, and I didn't include it in here, but there was a study that NIST, the National Institute of Security of Standards and Technology, did years and years ago, that just showed the impact of finding flaws or defects later in a software lifecycle, and just the amount of cost or work necessary as you find these defects in the test or production phases of an application's lifecycle is significant. And so you want to, you know, not be bolting security on, as we talked about, and then do it later. You want to try to do it, you know, as early as possible. And sometimes that means the security people need to be involved, or those that are trained or aware. And again, to your point, Tanisha, if the development people understand security issues well enough, they can do it themselves. But many times that's not the case. And one of the things that we've seen is just the impact of the pandemic and how it's accelerated DevOps as well as DevSecOps initiatives. And the survey results indicated, and it's not a surprise to me, that the increase is a reflection of the increased demand for digital offerings, right? There's a lot of an increase of digitalization in organizations and the usage of applications, whether it be customer facing or inward facing. They've seen a pretty big spike then as a result of just being, you know, the driver to get push things to prod faster. Now, I apologize for the fuzziness of this image. I snagged it from somewhere else, but I thought it did a good job of sort of talking about some of the roles, because I think if you look at DevOps and the different groups you're trying to work with, I mean, you have the software developers and you have architects. You also have the operations side of the house. The security engineer on the far right is potentially really more of a software security engineer. Just putting a little adjective on top of there. I worked at Booz Allen, and it's important to get. I struggle trying to find the right kinds of people to plug into these kind of efforts. And you may think that a security engineer, quote unquote, is adequate, but if they don't have development experience, many times they can't speak the same language and understand how to explain to developers when there is a finding what the impact is and how to remediate, say, a cross-site scripting vulnerability or a SQL injection error. And so that's one of the things that is key, that it's really more somebody that has at least an understanding of how to communicate back to development in ways that they understand. But again, you also have, I would add another role on here. Sometimes you have the folks that are looking at and triaging the testing results, right, with development. And then you may also have a more of a remediation specialist. So that could be another role that you have as part of this overall team. I mentioned security champions, and Tanisha, you're saying that maybe this is not something that is worthwhile, but I see that, again, the security champion is somebody who can make that, bridge that gap, and it's called different things. Gary McGraw from Cigital coined the term evangelist. You also see folks call it black belt, so indicating that they've gone through the training, whether it be internal or external training that indicates that they are an expert. And it could be, again, a security champion could be somebody who comes from the development side. It could be somebody that comes on the cybersecurity side, or an architect. A variety of different roles could be in, types of people can play this role. But the key is that the champion ultimately needs to be able to have the passion or enthusiasm around improving security and the security posture of the applications. I mean, that's what you really are looking for. And again, there typically would be a lead for the security champions program that would most likely be part of the security team. And they are, ultimately sort of like growing the champions. They are trying to encourage them and provide them with differentiation. To some degree, having that champion is a great way of showing some kind of career path growth, and a way of enabling them to differentiate themselves from the rest of the development team. But the thing that I see in more mature application security programs that have DevOps they're trying to support is a healthy security champion program that is able to scale what typically is a limited security team and very limited application security team specifically, to be able to work with a much broader development environment. The development teams typically are outnumbering the security team. We had one survey that showed 80-1. And so you just don't have the ability to staff up your application security team adequately enough to be in all those different project teams. So you want to be able to have those dotted line folks that are trained up, and well equipped. In our context, as far as a software vendor, what we're trying to do is integrate our solutions into the different phases of the pipeline, right? So we're able to do software composition analysis and open source software analysis through our partnership with Sonatype. We're able to do static code analysis, both as a service as well as on-prem, and we're able to integrate it into the build process. We can do it upon commit. The developers can do it during unit testing. So we have a variety of different ways in which you can actually do static code analysis and get results back to the developers immediately as they're doing as they're coding, if they have a commit, or during the build process, which many of the organizations take advantage of. Dynamic scanning is classically, and you have to have a running application. We are certainly doing that, Tanisha, during the QA process, and can also do continuous monitoring of production environments. But we are shifting dynamic scans left as well, so that you can actually leverage functional test scripts and use that as input into your dynamic scanning engine to be able to limit what you're testing, and get those results much faster than a complete dynamics test of an application. And then there's runtime, so you have interactive application security testing, or IaaS, and then RASP is runtime application security protection. So you can monitor and protect applications in the production environment. And so when we're dealing with organizations trying to integrate in security testing, part of the challenge that we have is figuring out, well, what kind of resources do they have available and what makes sense now? They already have penetration testing as an example. Integrating in dynamic may be relatively easy because they're familiar with that phase of testing, and you can automate some of that kind of outside in analysis with a dynamic test. If they don't have developer types that can do static, that's going to be a challenge, but you can provide it as a service. And you have to understand the processes they've got. Does it make sense to do a central service and possibly pull it off the build server? Or do they want to have their developers gotten up to speed to be able to run their unit level testing and commits and get feedback immediately? In some cases, it's both. They want to have the developers have the opportunity to figure out what potential is vulnerability in their particular in their code at the unit level, so they can fix it before they send it up to the central service and be able to do the build testing there. But there is no one right way. Lots of organizations have done it differently. And then another key, yeah, go ahead.
Quick question on that last slide. So when we typically talk about, SaaS and DaaS, it's usually, in a penetration testing, role later on in the life cycle. It seems like this is actually integrated into the development process.
Yeah.
So are you actually doing this, I don't want to say twice, because typically the penetration testing is done by an external group, but are you doing this as a way to kind of push these processes left in the process? Yep. So it's kind of duplicating the effort, but then also, preparing yourself for, making sure that you're up to code or whatever when you get towards those ending processes.
Yep. So the whole idea is to lessen the load on the pen testers, right? If you can find these vulnerabilities and weaknesses earlier than that late lifecycle test, then that's the objective, right? So yes, a lot of our customers are doing just that. You're doing the static code analysis during the coding phase, and you can, again, dynamic, we're shifting left as well, where you actually can leverage your functional test scripts for a subset of your full application and do dynamic testing there as well. So yes, that is a frequent approach that our customers are using. And in general, that's the best practice out there, is to, again, certainly do static code analysis, as early as possible in the development phase. And, again, if you're talking DevOps, you're dealing with all these sprints, right? And then the question is, given your resources and how you want to do the model, do you pull it off the build? Do you enable the developers? What works best for you and your organization? And some people, as they mature, they may start with that periodic testing coming off of a build server, and then they want to push it down to educate the developers, enable them to actually understand the weaknesses as they're coding, and hopefully fix it before the security team or whoever the central process is doing the test off the build server. Does that make sense, Tanisha?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know it's best practice. It's just that having worked in, I think coming up in my career, I did mostly waterfall. So, more recently we've been doing, a lot of agile things, and typically you don't see these, actually built in until, you get to the penetration test, which may or may not be done depending on, whether it's a compliance requirement for, depending on what type of industry it is, right? So like, we talk about in theory, as an educator, you talk about in theory that this is the best practice. It's just interesting to actually see this, in mature organizations actually being done.
So to your point, when I joined Fannie Mae back in 2010, they had a large internal penetration testing team that basically, on a risk basis, right, would do pen testing of apps late life cycle, right? And they had 8 people on staff doing pen testing, a good sized team. I made, along with a CISO, I was a deputy CISO at the time, we made the case to shift things left, where we would actually do static code analysis, and we put it at the build level as a centralized service. And over time, what they've done, and that was again probably around the 2012 was when we rolled it out finally. Now they have much more of a DevOps approach, because back then it was more waterfall, to your point, and we were integrating into their SDL standard at the time. Now it's a lot fewer hard gates, the design and other subsequent, because it's very agile and and they've enabled the developers to do a lot of the testing and put the responsibility on the developers. Equifax is doing that too, where the CISO's approach is saying, I am, the developers own the security and they have to do the testing, and I am the governance and I'm monitoring how well they're doing. And I'm not going to let critical stuff out into production. So he's, the Equifax CISO has stepped out of being responsible for doing all the testing. Again, goes back to the point, there's no one way of doing this, right? He's having development own that, but he is doing the governance and making sure that it gets done, and will stop things if it's too critical before it goes into prod. So again, there's lots of different ways, but a lot of organizations are doing just that. But one of the things that you have to consider is, again, just there's so many dev tools out there now, and finding, that's one of the things that we are constantly trying to do, is integrate and keep the integrations up to date as new tools are rolling out and in use, and have the API that allows for integration if we don't explicitly have a plugin for it. And so, again, the IDEs, how we can plug in with these IDEs. We have the ability to do source code repositories. The most popular service as far as build servers. Supporting different open source tools. And ticketing systems, because again, even though we have a centralized place for findings, Software Security Center for looking at the results for our dynamic and static code, a lot of times they don't want to go to another console, right? They want to look at give us the findings in the bug tracking system or ticketing system that we're used to. And so use Jira, and so again, part of the understanding of what works best for that particular dev team is understanding the tooling that they're using, and ensuring that you can reduce that friction, reduce the swivel chair of, oh, I have to look over here to find the security results. I don't want to do that. I want to just find it in the tracking tool I'm used to. So anyway, but I just wanted to have, I didn't want to have too many slides. I just wanted to have that to go over that, but then I'll happy to open it up for questions. Let me see, stop sharing. There we go. All right, so I left plenty of time to have a general discussion. I think that I guess I'll ask first off if anybody has any questions about the concept of DevSecOps. Is that pretty clear?
So I'm just curious, I guess, and I guess more so asking for the squad, how are these folks being hired? Are they being hired as developers, or are they being hired specifically in DevSecOps roles? Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so again, it sort of depends on organization. So let me just give an example. If an organization is doing DevOps and they have, let's say in the context of Equifax, right, where the CISO has pushed the responsibility for security down onto the dev team, then they will be looking for folks that have some security awareness. Going back to your point about hopefully these developers aren't coming in cold, or they're going to be going through their security training program when they come on board, right? Because they have a pretty extensive one there at Equifax to help them get up to speed. If you look at in the context of the application security team within InfoSec, there are those that are potentially software security engineers, right? That may be that primary responsibility for helping stand up the application security capability, the governance, potentially the running and triaging of the tests, if they do it centrally, right? And so though they're hiring, I used to be in that situation where I'd be hiring those individuals to basically help stand up the program and as well as do the testing and the triage. Okay, and then in some cases there are other roles that are sort of outside of that are vulnerability management, right? That's sort of related because you may want to have the results pulled over to a centralized GRC or vulnerability management capability. So, but I am seeing in the again the emphasis or the power shifting over to dev. The dev side certainly is driving the ship many times as far as what tools are being selected, but as far as the people, it could be a split. I got a comment here. All right, let's see the chat. Sorry, I did not see the chat yet.
Oh, it's okay. The question is, in your opinion, what is the best approach to create a secure app but still prevent bottlenecks towards development caused by library restriction?
Bottlenecks or development caused by library restrictions. So one of the things you can do is have a vetted set of libraries, right? Is specifically to that point. You can actually have, for example, a pre-scanned, pre-analyzed set of libraries that are then used by the development teams. And so you could have a specific function for encryption, so if you're doing application level encryption, that this is the function you use. If you're using some kind of privileged access management, CyberArk or something like that, here are the calls that you use, here are the functions that you would use. Make it very, being a gardener for that and maintaining it is a pain. But that is one of the approaches that has been used out there. OWASP, if you're familiar with the Open Web Application Security Project, the Enterprise API or something like that. They had a project specifically around this, coming up with language specific, excuse me, language specific libraries and functions that could be leveraged, and then organizations can take that and build off of it.
I am a developer, and I guess I work and I have to actively sort of maintain, I guess like security upgrades and stuff. So like software gets run through programs like, I guess it could be OWASP, but I'm a little bit more familiar with like Fortify.
Yep.
That'll, scan for vulnerabilities with different rule packs.
Right.
But with the I know, I guess through my experience, there's been sort of like crazy vulnerabilities where they'll point out something in like the framework of literally JS. That's, we build our stuff in JavaScript, and they'll say, oh, something in a minified version of the code of literally the JavaScript language is a vulnerability. And then that's like something we have to deal with.
Yeah, and so I mean, again, depending on what you then do as analysis on whether or not that truly is something you need to be addressing or not, you could also come up with a filter that would, in future scans, let's say you've done the analysis, there's nothing you can do about it, it's a known risk, you're going to, actually upgrade at, this point in time in the future, then you can put a filter in and say, okay, we're going to filter out that result. That won't be a hit in the future scans, so that you're not slowed down until that's dealt with, right?
Yeah. I've also I've experienced where, let's say like they implemented the kind of like approach that you're talking about, where there is I guess you would say like a secured or maybe signed set of libraries or packages
right, that are
you want
approved.
developers to use, but there can also be, I guess you want to say, gotchas. So for instance, say you're working in Java, and you have your different jar libraries, and they have specific versions. Sometimes those versions may have various dependencies that you may not even thought about or accounted for. So there is, in my opinion, bottlenecks with trying to develop, because you may have a specific feature you may have to develop towards or with, but you're sort of stuck in progressing, I guess, with the normal means, because you're missing packages that weren't very kind of like spelled out for you, that you needed in the the things that you already signed and approved for. Like, is a better approach in doing the DevOps thing? Like, is it possible to maybe create some kind of like sandbox or VM environment where you can have, I guess it's like wild packages that would help? I mean, I don't know, because I've dealt with this many times. I've done things where I've sort of tried to develop things in, I guess, like the quote unquote unsecure environment, and then try to import those solutions to the more secure ones. Most time it was difficulties in doing that, or it was just a big nope, and I had to find some workaround with that. But I don't know if your experience if you've ran into that and some other alternatives.
I've run into it many times, not as in your seat, because I haven't been a developer having to deal with it as much, more of on the other side, where I'm trying to force change, right? It's like, well, I'm on the side saying, hey, this is a vulnerable library or component. What are you guys going to do about it?
Yeah. It's tough dealing with.
I don't have an easy answer for you, as far as, because I'm always the one saying, hey, I can't, that keeps hitting on my list of vulnerabilities, and I want you to deal with it. And you're saying, well, hey, I've got this legacy set code, so I'm not going to be able to make the change until 2 years from now. It's like, well, that's not adequate. So what's our mitigating control to help prevent that from being exploited? Well, it can't be exploited. It's buried down in the code. Anyway, back and forth, right?
Yeah.
So no, I don't have an easy answer for that. I think part of the purpose of some of these scans is to raise visibility and potential risks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, the then the question comes back down to, is it exploitable? What's the likelihood? And are there mitigating controls that you can put
Right.
in place potentially in runtime that would enable you to reduce that risk and give you time to hopefully upgrade that framework or that particular function. I don't personally care for risk acceptance broadly. I think it needs to be readdressed periodically, right? So if you've accepted a risk, let's say it's a critical risk, right? But you've accepted it because you don't have a choice. You still have to get the application out in prod, but due to business reasons. But you need to revisit that risk assessment like every quarter, every 6 months, to see if there's something you can do, or if it has increased even higher based on the threat landscape, right?
Right.
So that's just, again, I'm on that side of the equation many times more than in your seat.
Yeah.
So I
I said,
think
I'm,
that's
like I said, as a developer, like, I definitely understand the need and importance for security. And I definitely try, like I said, doing this stuff enough. I've become more aware of general things like sanitize your data, make sure your data comes from like secure sources and prevent cross-site scripting and cores and stuff like that. But it's just kind of difficult. And I wondered if there was like leveraging, like, so there's been a lot more tools over the years for DevOps. Like I remember I've used Jenkins. I know they add more and more add-ons and plugins.
Right.
And I know there's different things you said, like mention Sonar and stuff where you can put that in there, kind of like scan.
Sonotype, right? Looking at the composition, and that's helpful too. Hey man, I want to get to a couple of these other questions here.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say the risk acceptance is probably a good tie-in, because I feel like most of the time if you're accepting a risk, it's because the cost to resolve it is, doesn't justify it as a business need. And our next question is, if you have any insight on how to best communicate the need for early and intense security involvement to leadership with limited budget and knowledge in the area.
Yeah, that's always the challenge, right? You're trying to and going back to when I made the case to our CIO for shifting left, for building out application security capability, what I used was the fact that we've created pain late life cycle. We've stopped things from going into production because we find things when we do penetration testing. Our pen test team was good; it was finding things, but it's so late. And it's like my case was, I can reduce your costs, I can reduce the impact to the development processes if I find things earlier. And some of the other things you can look at, one of the frequent attempts of looking at what motivates the development leadership, right? If they have a metric around quality and looking at how security defects truly are just another defect, and we are impacting your quality and that metric, your MBO around quality for your applications. So getting them to understand that a security defect is another defect that impacts your quality, and it's already covered in your quality metrics, or should be. And if you look at the density of defects in an application, including security defects, then we should be in that equation. So that's looking at, more broadly, looking at the KPIs that they're being measured by and seeing how security can impact those KPIs. As far as the down in the weeds, working with the development team and getting them to understand why security needs to be included, again, it takes time. You get resistance sometimes. It's awareness raising. One of the techniques is leveraging things like hackathons, or basically some workshops where you can get the developers, and if you can bring them their own software that they can run tests on, and they can start understanding that, hey, they actually have produced vulnerable applications. They're hacking their own code. You're teaching some techniques as far as how hackers are exploiting SQL injection, and then they find the SQL injection vulnerability in their own software. That opens eyes. That doesn't really work at the leadership level. You've really got to get top-down kind of support for that, as far as ensuring that you get your CIO, your development managers on board to support security getting integrated in. But a lot of organizations are doing it now. So, I mean, I think it's, Tanisha, I mean, I think there's a spectrum, right? But I think a lot of organizations are recognizing, given the threat landscape, they've got to do something. They can't, but let's face it, a lot of the development shops are, are motivated by other things. They've got timelines. They got to get their features out. They got to get the applications pushed to production. And if something like security slows them down, that friction is not something they welcome. So you do need to work into, well, how are we helping you meet your objectives and how you're being measured, and security should be part of that. Does that help answer that at all?
Is it MechBiz? I think that was your question. Okay, they said absolutely, thank you. All right, so any other questions for our guest?
So I would just go back to emphasizing that this is something that security professionals, this meaning DevSecOps, is something that security professionals should be aware of if they are involved with any form of application security. And so there are a lot of resources out there associated with this. The Safe Code, OWASP, and other organizations have some great guidance. There's an organization called Build Security In, that the DHS did, that you can also go to. That's still, I think it's still up there. I think it folded around 2 years ago, but has some great information. Anyway, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email, you should have my email address.
All right, well, thank you. I appreciate you for coming out here today and speaking with us. As always, we always value the experience and the expertise that you bring. So I thank you again for coming out with us, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thanks, Tanisha. Bye, everybody.
All right.